Good morning and welcome. This is American Vineyard Live. I'm your host, Hiram Malcolm, and today we're diving into the historic 2024 Grape Crush Report. California has not seen a grape crush this small in decades. To help us break it all down and understand what this all means, we're joined by a powerhouse panel from Turrentine Brokerage. First, we have Audra Cooper, our moderator for today's panel. She is the director of Grape Brokerage and has years of experience in both the North and Central Coast. Audra grew up on ranches in the Central Coast and graduated from California State University at Fresno with a degree in agricultural economics. Joining us remotely, we have Christian Clear, the North Coast Grape Broker. Also a graduate of Fresno State, studying viticulture, he began his ag career at age 4, driving tractor during frost season, helping set smudge pots. He brings a wealth of experience with over 20 years in the vineyard business. Next is Mike Needham here in the studio. He is a broker partner and will represent the Central Valley Interior for us this morning. A seasoned vineyard manager and wine broker, Mike is also a graduate of Fresno State in viticulture. He brings decades of industry experience to the table. Thanks for joining us. And last but not least, joining us in the studio is Eddie Ehrman, the Central Coast Grape Broker for the Turrentine team. He has mountains of experience in vineyard management and brings a straightforward outlook on the wine industry. We have a lot to cover this morning, so we are going to jump right in. But before we do, I want to announce that we have 2 giveaways for our live viewers this morning. So thank you for joining us. We will be announcing those winners shortly. Also, we have received a few questions from our audience in advance of this webcast. If you'd like to submit a question at any time, feel free to text it to the number just below the streaming window. We'll be answering any questions at the end of the meeting. Thank you for joining us. And at this time, Audra, take it away.
Well, first and foremost, thank you so much for having us. We greatly appreciate the work that we've done over the years together and all the interviews, and we're excited to be here today to join you and give you a highlight of the 2024 preliminary crush report. I think it's really important to highlight that there is a final report coming out on March 10th, and there will be a little bit more data added to it as not all wineries have reported so far. So as you're hearing information today, it's important to know that it could change slightly in some cases, and we'll highlight this later. Christian will note this for us, is there may be a couple district averages that are affected by the final data points. A little housekeeping, we're going to be moving through from a macro perspective, and then we'll join into the different regions and the different varietals throughout California. So without further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at the total crop for 2024 came in at 2.84 million tons. If you look back over history, this slide goes all the way back to 2004, which is the last time it was this light. The chart that you're currently looking at is a bar graph of the CDFA recorded total wine grape crush for California. The red maroon bar is the 2024, and the yellow line that goes up and down throughout time is your all-in weighted district average. So all districts, all varietals throughout California. And if you'll take a look, you'll notice a trend, and it's hard to kind of see. When you go back from 2004 all the way to 2024, 20-year time, you actually do see an increase by almost 50% for that weighted average. Now, of course, that's achieved through extremes, particularly when you look at various varietals by region. You're not going to see necessarily a 50% increase over time for each variety for every area. When we jump into looking at kind of setting the stage for where we're at in the market, you'll see that this is a very interesting, very volatile looking inventory chart. So this is bulk wine available gallons through Turrentine Brokerage that are actively for sale. This is all regions, all vintages for California. This is not broken up by varietal for us. This is just a macro view. 1 year ago on that black line is February 7th of 2024 as compared to today on the far right side. You'll notice that we reached historical peak inventories last year at about 28 million gallons and change. And currently we're at 27.4 million gallons. We do anticipate that number to reach a higher peak historically once we get into the April-May timeline this year, due to most of the red from 2024 starting to finally make it to the market at that stage. So we will likely surpass historical peak of the calendar year 24. When we look at tons crushed by region, we're going to break this down by North Coast, Central Coast, Northern Interior, or Northern Central Valley, as well as the Southern Interior, and take a look at the percent change from 2024 from 23, as well as the percentages of the 5-year average. So without further ado, let's bring the team in. Christian, you're joining us now.
All right. I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you all. Pleasure being here today. Let's talk about the North Coast. So down 15% compared to a year ago, but actually up 3% compared to the 5-year average. So we weren't as affected dramatically as other regions in the state of California in regards to crop and the loss of crop, although down particularly in red grapes, Cabernet, and red blenders, very slow last year. I would say that had everything been harvested in the North Coast, we probably would have came pretty close to the last year's grape tonnage, especially in regards to red grapes.
We'll move into the Central Coast. Unlike the North Coast, the Central Coast was heavily affected by heat spells and a reduced crop. We were down 35% from 2023 and 29% from the 5-year average. The causes for that are kind of interesting because unlike the Central Valley where removals have been a major effect, the Central Coast was really just down to climatic reasons and not as much to removals, even though there are some removals.
So for the Northern Interior, we saw a net loss of 233,000 tons in 2024, which was a 24% change from 1 year ago, and then a 19% change over a 5-year average. And then the Southern Interior saw a 311,000 ton drop in a net loss, and then 21% year over year, and a 27% over a 5-year average. So for the reasons that was just explained, grapes were left on the vine, heat, and then with removals, those all contributed to the loss of tonnage being delivered to wineries in 2024.
Mike, let's talk a little bit about what was left on the vine in 24 compared to 23. You know, there's a broad range of estimates for 23 and 24 for that matter. What's your opinion on grapes left on the vine, whether that's due to marketability or rejections or just simply, vine age, so on and so forth?
It's a hard number to pin down, but it's somewhere north of 100,000 and between there and 200,000 tons that was left on the vine.
So we'll move into Cabernet now, the king of California. Structurally, this varietal has moved into true oversupply, both from a bulk wine perspective and a grape perspective throughout the state of California. There are some regions that are more oversupplied than others, specifically the Central Coast, Monterey County specifically, as well as the Lodi Delta area in the Northern Interior. And we'll get to a little bit more of that in just a second. As we move into looking at our crop recent history, you are looking at the competitive sets. Napa, moving from left to right, Napa, Sonoma, Napa, Sonoma, North Coast, Central Coast, Lodi Delta, and then the Southern Interior. You'll notice that we have the gray spacer bar as the 2024 preliminary crush report totals for those regions, as well as dating back to 2019. So without further ado, Christian, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about Napa, Sonoma, and then finally North Coast from your perspective on 2024.
Yeah, thanks, Audra. I'm just going to go ahead and say it. Is the king dead? Because we don't see a lot of activity in regards to Cabernet, and where there is activity, that activity has been, well below district average pricing in regards to contracts this year moving into 2025. As you can tell on the chart here, not a bad crop in the North Coast, especially for Napa. Didn't match the 24 tonnage, but we did do a little bit better than we saw in 23 and 22 and 21 and 20. So the crop was actually pretty decent, and we feel like it probably would have been even larger than that had we not seen some late season heat waves come through and wipe out a lot of that weight with clusters still on the vines and dehydrating dramatically the last 2-3 weeks prior to harvest. So I spoke to some growers in Napa who thought that they lost thousands of tons just in 1 week due to weight loss with the heat waves that we saw late season. Sonoma County, pretty average, a little bit below 22, 23 crop. Obviously, 24 was a large crop. It's going to be hard to match that unless you look a little bit further back in time to 2018, but still a decent crop in Sonoma as well. And in the North Coast, we weren't that far behind 22, 23. It was a decent crop, and there was a lot of fruit left out on the vine. I want to reiterate to everybody here today that there was Cabernet in the North Coast that did not get harvested. There was Cabernet in Sonoma and Napa that did not get harvested. What this crop would have looked like had all that Cabernet been harvested, hard to tell, but we have estimates on thousands of tons being left on the vine. So that could have had a great impact on the total tons crushed in the North Coast and Napa and Sonoma. I'll say it again, maybe the king is dead. I don't know who the replacement is for the next king, but Cabernet may not be the king anymore.
All right, so moving into the Central Coast, we have a pretty stark contrast to the North Coast. The Central Coast saw historically light yields. When we're talking Cabernet in the Central Coast, we're typically going to be District 8, Paso Robles. An example of that is in 2023, we picked 95,000 tons. In 2024, we picked 55,000 tons. If you were to consider how many tons were still left on the vine in 2023 versus 2024, you would see that potentially we could have been down as much as 50% from the previous year. As far as what was crushed, we were down about 43%. So big differences between North Coast and Central Coast. Interesting thing about the Central Coast is since the crop was so light, we did see replacement demand pick up towards the end of harvest, and most tonnage in Paso for cab got picked. But that was solely due to wineries looking to replace the demand that they already wanted. It wasn't new demand.
Fulfilling current contract supply, correct?
So moving on to the valley, Lodi Delta had roughly 50,000 tons less that were produced in 2024. And that's an equivalency of 2.8 million cases worth of grapes that is not going to go into the system off of a 5-year average, which we thought was an interesting note to put on this spreadsheet or our graph here. The lack of demand kept grapes on the vine without a home in the valley with the removal of vineyards and below average yields. Those all contributed as we've mentioned before. The southern interior saw a decrease of 35,000 tons in 2024 for the same reasons that I just mentioned.
So when we look at the district average price, which is the other major factor of the crush report that is extraordinarily useful for both growers and buyers for that matter, wineries, this is Cabernet district average per ton for all of the major growing regions. The blue at the top is Napa Valley. And then as we move down, it goes Sonoma, North Coast, Central Coast in green, all districts of the Central Coast, and then the northern interior and southern interior. When we look at the district average, it's important to note that this is oftentimes anywhere from a year to 2 years trailing behind the spot market average and the spot market activity. So while it's a good barometer of current contracted prices, it's not exactly a perfect picture of current market. And I think Christian has a really great explanation of that when it comes to Napa Cab.
Yeah, well said, Audra. This graph is a little deceiving. I appreciate the upfront notification on that by you, Audra. So this is going to be a little bit tricky to explain, but let's get into it a little bit. There's a lot of contracts still in play that were made 2 or 3 years ago that have escalators built into them, especially in Napa County. And those escalators have been rising, and that price has been rising, what the wineries have been paying for those contracts for the past 3 years, and continues to do that all the way through even this year. Although we are seeing a lot of contracts fall off this year, I think we will see a much bigger dip in the district average next year and the following year, as Audrey said, but this really is a little bit deceiving. I would recommend growers not pay too much attention to this district average price because the wineries who are actually out contracting grapes aren't paying that much of attention to these district averages as well. They're going to pay what they can afford to pay for this fruit, and it's not going to be at the same price that what we saw for the last 3 years in this rising district average. Also, the fruit that was not harvested doesn't count as a zero against this in the calculation that the USDA uses to calculate this district average. So fruit unharvested, which there was a lot of, especially in regards to Cabernet and the North Coast, Sonoma and Napa, that did not get counted for in this report. And had it been counted as a zero, I think we would have seen these district averages for Napa, Sonoma, and the North Coast drop dramatically compared to what they did this year.
Yeah, for the Central Coast, we saw similar things as Christian commented on, that there were many multi-year contracts with escalators built in that are still reaching towards the end of their terms. However, we did see a big difference, as Christian did, from the contract, the district average, and the spot market. The spot market was still substantially lower than the district average. And for that reason, we didn't see a huge reflection of that. Like, there wasn't a lot of fruit that was contracted late. And growers also fulfilled any contracts they had at the higher pricing.
Quick question for you on the Central Coast district average. Now, obviously, it's all districts all in, but where's most of the Cabernet coming from in the Central Coast as far as volume?
Yeah, that's a good point. So to bring that up again, it's Paso Robles. Like, Paso Robles is going to be most of the cab in the Central Coast, the lion's share.
So District 8, San Luis Obispo County.
That's correct. Yeah.
And then one other thing that we should probably note here as well, for those listening in, is these weighted averages are coming from Table 10, which is grower returns. So we're not talking internal winery fruit pricing being recorded here. These are purely grower contracted tons.
And then looking at the valley, we've grouped in together Lodi Delta, which is essentially districts 11 and 17, and that price ended up being $678 per ton. And then Southern Interior, which is District 12 south through District 14, and that price ended up being $496 per ton. Very few. It was limited deals that happened in 2024, and what you see on this graph is that there's not a lot of change. And if historically you go back and you look at it 20 years back, the pricing hasn't changed very much when it comes to the district average pricing. Each year there is some spot market pricings that go up and down, but the majority of the grapes that are in contract year after year in the multi-year contracts keeps that pricing fairly stable. So when you're looking at these graphs, keep that in mind.
So I'm going to spice it up a little bit and argue with Christian for a second and say, I don't think the king is dead. I think he's just left the building. So we'll move on to the queen of the state, which is Chardonnay. She's had a little bit of a challenge for sure, but she's also been a little bit more imbalanced from a supply standpoint than other varietals throughout the state, or at least the major varieties. But the challenge with her is it ebbs and flows a lot, and it ebbs and flows very quickly. So when we look at the total recent crop history, we'll start with Christian again and Napa and go into the North Coast. And I think we should probably focus a little bit on the North Coast on this one versus Napa Sonoma.
Yeah, thanks, Audra. I appreciate the back and forth in regards to the king. Maybe Chardonnay being the queen can also be the king, because we are actually seeing a lot more interest in Chardonnay, white grapes in general, in the North Coast. As you can tell from the charts here, we had a decent crop of Chardonnay in the North Coast in 24. We did see, North Coast really pump out some tons, and there was actually a market for that fruit in the North Coast, Mendocino particularly. And we did see, a large winery come in and clear out all the available Chardonnay in that area this last year. And there were a few actually that came over. I think some wineries got shorted in the Central Valley and the Central Coast, didn't feel like the crop was there, and they came up and took some chances with the fruit in Mendocino County. And as of today, everyone has reported that the quality was very good. So some positive stuff happening as well in regards to Chardonnay in the North Coast. I'd also like to point out Sonoma's crop of Chardonnay was not that bad. Obviously, it did not match the 24 or 23 crop, but the 24 crop was right in line with the last 4 years before that, if not beating them by a little bit as well. So the crop decent there, even with the heat wave that hit us late season. So had that heat wave not hit us, late in the harvest or towards harvest, we might even seen more tons come in. Napa is pretty much average on Chardonnay. I would like to point out that, the most sought after Chardonnay in the North Coast is from Sonoma County, and that's where we saw a decent crop. We did not see any Chardonnay left on the vine in Sonoma County or Napa County or the North Coast, to be frank. So those are good signs that market is healthy. At least there's some demand for that. Hopefully that carries over into 25 this year. We are seeing decent activity currently, with a little bit of a price adjustment with the availability that's out there, but I think we've got good traction. Wineries seem interested in that varietal. It's a quicker wine to make. They can get it back on the retail shelves and get it back to the consumer, and consumers seem to be buying white wines.
So for the Central Coast, the Central Coast really has a couple regions, obviously, that grows Chardonnay. We have Monterey, Santa Barbara, and Edna Valley. We see kind of a contrast between the different regions within the Central Coast. Santa Barbara has been affected pretty greatly by removals. And so part of the reduction we're seeing in tonnage, I think, is due to removals. Edna's also suffered some removals in the past couple of years. Monterey County has had some, but that's where the lion's share of the Chardonnay is now coming from. The market is very slow to start this season, which signals that it's still not in balance for the Central Coast. There's pricing challenges for Edna and Santa Barbara County versus the volume that wineries really need to purchase from those regions. And Monterey County can typically produce it at a lower price point that is more conducive to the current spot market.
And for the Central Valley, Chardonnay and Lodi Delta districts 11 and 17 saw a decrease in 60,000 tons in 2024. And that is a 1.9 million decrease off of a 5-year average of a case equivalency. So a lot of grapes that weren't there previously that aren't going to make their way to the market. Chardonnay, most all Chardonnay in the Valley did find a home in 2024. It's a lot different dynamic than what we saw with Cabernet Sauvignon, and there was some late activity of buyers coming back to the market, picking up some supply late in the season with their early picks coming in light, and then also there was some late season activity there was a lot of late season activity on it. Southern Interior also saw a decrease in yields of 15,000 tons, which was a little bit less dramatic than what we saw up north, but primarily because of heat was what affected the crop in the Valley.
Mike, Chardonnay came in stronger in general in the Central Valley than I would have expected, considering all the removals that have happened. Do you agree with Christian that Chardonnay might be kind of dethroning Cab as far as the leadership role in California?
It has more activity than Cabernet for sure, but it's I don't know if it's going to take over as the king quite yet.
Okay. Well, we'll move into pricing, and we'll start off with Christian, specifically regarding Sonoma County and the highlight there.
Yeah, again, I want to reiterate that, it's about a 2-year delay before we see what's actually happening in the market be reflected onto the USDA crop report in regards to pricing on the district average. Again, we had carryover contracts that were contracted at the peak of contracting pricing, and those contracts are still carrying through, especially in Napa and Sonoma. We did see quite a big drop in Mendocino with some opportunistic buying late season with the amount of fruit that was available up there, a large crop, and some needs from Valley wineries that are stuck at paying a price that still makes their bottle program. So we did see some of that fruit get hauled out to the interior Valley due to light crops out there and a lot of removals. That pricing, isn't in line with most North Coast pricing, which did have an effect on the district average pricing here. But I would say, again, Chardonnay seems to be the most sought after varietal in the North Coast with the largest percentage of acres planted to it. I'm still arguing that it could still take over the kingdom as the top grape in the next 5 years.
Christian, quick question for you. How much is sparkling playing an influence on the market and where in the North Coast?
Great question, Audra. There is quite a few sparkling contracts still in play in the North Coast. Mendocino County, Sonoma County tends to be where the majority of those larger contracts are at. Although we have seen a decrease in the past 2 years of sparkling houses actually out making contracts. And it appears that they are starting to look to the interior valley, specifically the Delta tends to be a spot that they've started shopping now for that fruit. And we're not seeing as many sparkling houses in play in the North Coast the last 2 years. And as those contracts that they made 2 or 3 years ago fall off, we will see a decrease in the district average affected in the next 2 years on the USDA Crush Report.
Thank you for that, Christian.
So as Christian mentioned, there's typically a delay for the district average to respond to the spot market and downward pricing. You can see the Central Coast did trend down slightly last year. And I think that's important due to the fact that we still saw a reduced overall tonnage in the Central Coast dramatically, I think by 1.8 million cases. So even though we saw a lighter crop, the district average price still did come down, signaling that the deals that were done last season were below the district average. So big divergence between the district average and the spot market, unfortunately. Now there is still some, premium AVAs that are doing okay in Santa Barbara County and in Monterey County, such as Arroyo or Santa Lucia Highlands or Santa Rita Hills. But as far as the volume goes, the downward pressure is pretty substantial.
I think those are all really, really good points, and I don't want to overplay what I'm about to say, but I think mildly it's a positive to see the district average all in drop down a little bit because it's an indicator that most of those tons were able to sell that were available on the spot market. So it influenced, negatively the district average, but it was a positive sign that there was enough demand to pick up a lot of the fruit that was available despite being a lighter crop.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and I think we'll see in upcoming varieties that we didn't see a respond in district average because the fruit just didn't move.
Yeah.
So it's a great point.
And in the valley, Lodi Delta, as you see from the graph, we didn't really see too much of a drop in price. Those combined between 11 and 17 ended up being $566 per ton. And then Southern Interior, the average price for 12, 13, and 14 was $480 a ton. But like I mentioned before, everything did find a home in 2024 for Chardonnay. So, but that was because of the crop being light. If the crop wasn't as light as it was, some of those grapes might have ended up staying on the vine.
So we'll move into Pinot Noir. This has been certainly a tough one throughout California, specifically for the Central Valley as well as the Central Coast, where the majority of the volume is coming from for California. It was a bright spot in the market back in 2006 all the way through about 2018. And then once a lot of the plantings and graftings were fully realized, along with some significantly high yielding years, we really saw a downfall in regards to the overall positioning of Pinot Noir throughout the state. This is one that I do want to highlight, though, where a lot of the work to reduce supply has been done with removals, particularly some virus areas or areas in which Pinot Noir really probably shouldn't have been planted. A lot of that's been removed. And it is reflective in the crop history when we take a look at this for the competitive sets.
Yeah, and I'll start off with talking about the North Coast here. Obviously, again, not a huge dip in tons produced in any of the 4 North Coast counties. As you can tell, Sonoma leads the way with the most plantings and the most acreage of Pinot Noir. We're down from the 23 crop, above the 22 crop, right in line with the 21 crop. So I would say, what's important to take away on this is that we did not see a lot of mid-season or late-season activity for Pinot Noir in Sonoma County or anywhere in the North Coast for that matter. And there was still a lot of fruit left out there. I had this crop pegged as being pretty large this last year in 24. I think we would have seen those numbers rise quite a bit had all the fruit that had been grown in the North Coast been harvested. So we saw a huge drop off in contracting, and then no late season spot market buying in regards to Pinot Noir anywhere in the North Coast. Mendocino, Sonoma County, which tends to be the most sought after areas, or Napa Carneros for that matter. So I don't think this is a fair representation of the actual tons that were produced of Pinot Noir on the North Coast, because those tons just weren't all harvested.
So the Central Coast is following its theme of 2024 to where we were extremely impacted. However, Pinot Noir was extremely impacted for multiple reasons, not only because of the light crop, but also it was still the variety that if fruit was left on the vine, oftentimes it was Pinot Noir. There are also a lot of removals to, I think the most removals in the Central Coast are typically Pinot Noir. So Pinot Noir continues to be a struggle with fruit still left on the vine. Pricing, which we'll run into in a moment, is still very challenged. Overall, Pinot Noir is a tough sell on Central Coast right now.
20,000 tons were left on the vine in the Lodi Delta region in 2024. Southern Interior saw a drop in production of around 5,000 tons. It was very, very challenging to find anybody looking for any Pinot Noir in the valley in 2024. And because of what's going on in the North Coast and then the Central Coast, that puts downward pressure on price, and then makes buyers look at all of their options throughout California. And a lot of times winemakers will prefer to get coastal Pinot Noir if they have the choice, and if it's moving at California pricing. And that's currently what's happened last year and kind of going on for Pinot Noir in the valley this year. So it's in a tough spot.
In the past, Mike, sparkling has been a pretty big factor for Pinot Noir in the Delta area. How much of a factor is it currently?
It depends on who it is. A lot of them have been pulling back over the last couple of years and just challenged with the economy and being very conservative on their sourcing. So it's challenging on that front also.
Okay, moving right along to the district average pricing. Starting off with Christian.
Yeah. So again, I want to reiterate, which I've said multiple times today, that this district average pricing is not a fair representation of what's actually happening in today's current market. As you can tell, Sonoma County leads the way in the North Coast on Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir tends to be very favored in Sonoma County, even above Napa County, one of the only varietals that will beat Napa County out for a district average price. Clearly, it held pretty strong at 3,700 per ton. That is not what's happening in the market currently. We are actually seeing very little, if any, interest in Pinot Noir currently in Sonoma County or anywhere in the North Coast. I've been having a lot of conversations with Pinot growers. We do need to remove acres in the North Coast, Sonoma County, Mendocino County. They're starting to talk about that, but what do you change to? That's the next big question. And we'll talk about that here in the next varietal we've discussed. But Pinot Noir really oversupplied in the North Coast. The reason the district average was not affected because we did not see any late season spot market buying on this variety. Whereas I think Audra brought up earlier with Chardonnay and the Central Coast and in the North Coast, we did see a dip in that district average. And that is a reflection of some late season buying with interest in Chardonnay, but we did not see that in Pinot Noir in any of the 4 counties in the North Coast. So very, very tough, difficult varietal right now with very, very little interest, although there's pockets of, high-end Russian River Valley areas that people are going to still continue to buy from, Carneros, Napa, and Sonoma, areas that people will continue to buy Pinot, but there's areas that have Pinot that are virus that need to be pulled out, replanted, and until we get that, acreage down in a more balanced situation, we're going to continue to see the district average and pricing being offered for that fruit drop in the next year or two.
Christian, I have a question for you regarding the district average pricing. When I was up in the North Coast years ago, it was really common for Pinot Noir and Russian River, anywhere in Sonoma County, to be tied to the district average on contract price and have automatic increases. How common is that today?
Well, those contracts are still in play that were put in, in effect 2-3 years ago. They're starting to term out now, and we'll start to see that shift here this year and next year. Although there are going to be, gold soils that people are going to actually hold true to that kind of pricing for highly sought after small pocket regions of Pinot Noir in certain areas. But the majority of them, that district average pricing or any kind of new contracts being tied to that will be out the door this year and next year.
So Christian gave me a perfect segue for the Central Coast. Certain AVAs within the Central Coast are pulling district average up, but the volumes are small, and we didn't see any reflection in district average as far as the spot market because the sales just didn't get executed. I think in Santa Barbara County we had very few Pinot sales that went through, and if all the tonnage would have been picked at smart market pricing, we would have seen a dramatic response in district average. So many tons still went unpicked.
In the valley without the tons getting picked and left on the vine. I mean, if a ton stays on the vine, it doesn't show up in the district average price. So theoretically, that should be a 0, which would bring down the district average price. But it doesn't show up as that; it just shows up as not. So that's why you see the flatlining effect of the long range or long term pricing throughout the valley for Pinot and other reds.
So we'll move into a bright spot in the market, which is Sauvignon Blanc. And I throw out a little bit of caution regarding the bright spot because that bright spot's pretty mature at this stage. It's been a positive area in the market now for about 5+ years. So we'll go right into tons crushed and talk about the changes that we've seen over the last 5 years.
Yeah, and so this is what I was alluding to in regards to, transitioning from maybe Pinot Noir in Sonoma County to another varietal that might be more sought after. We need to be very careful with this varietal. It tends to be alternate bearing. A lot of new acres have gone in the ground the last 3 to 5 years in the state of California. North Coast, had a strong, I think, up 7%. If you look at the North Coast chart there on Sauvignon Blanc, they had a strong yield. The yield was a little bit down in Napa and Sonoma compared to the previous year, but still decent returns, down I think 8 to 10% compared to the year before. We did see all Sauv Blanc get contracted in the North Coast. I want to say that, but as we got into the spot market late season, fruit that was not contracted early on in Napa and Sonoma then traded at a North Coast district average pricing. So all 4 counties at the end of last year were trading at the same price, although there was activity and interest in that fruit late season. The price was pretty much the same whether you were buying it in Lake County, District 2, or District 3, or 4, or 1 for that matter. So there was no price difference at the end of the year. Although I think we'll see it, a strong price held in Sauv Blanc in the next slide. I think I want to warn growers that a little bit of Sauv Blanc goes a long way, and being alternate bearing, if we had a light crop the year before, it's probably going to be a heavy crop the next year, and one big crop could throw this out of balance. So it does feel very balanced. Out of all varietals that we'll discuss today, Sauvignon Blanc feels like the most balanced varietal. I will also reiterate, a colleague of mine, Mark Cuneo, from our team likes to point out on most of the talks that we talk, this is a very small category. It's only 4% compared to Chardonnay and Cabernet, very, very small. We like to talk about it a lot because it is a good story, but I would warn growers, do not graft over or plant Sauvignon Blanc unless you have a planting contract or a grafting contract with a winery. Doing it on spec may work for a year or 2, but at some point it will come back and bite you. And we can throw balance off very quickly in this industry with one hot varietal. And I'm concerned that this is the varietal that everybody is looking at to do that with. And I just want to preach caution today.
Eddie, with the 5 heat spikes that we had in the Central Coast, Sauvignon Blanc was kind of our canary in the coal mine. And I remember getting a phone call from you about how extreme it was in regards to yields. Can you talk a little bit about your experience last year with Sauvignon Blanc?
Yeah, so Sauvignon Blanc last year was, like Audra said, our canary in the coal mine. That as we started picking, we realized it was substantially lighter than our estimates and substantially lighter than than the 5-year average. I think to piggyback on that, what's interesting if you look at the previous 5 years, even though the crop was probably close to 50% off, in my opinion, for most growers, we still picked a fairly reasonable amount of Sauvignon Blanc for the Central Coast. And while most Sauvignon Blanc found a home last year in the Central Coast, it was due to that light crop and not really due to new demand or additional demand. And what's been somewhat surprising to me so far this season is Sauvignon Blanc has been very slow to start in the Central Coast. So piggybacking on Christian there, I'm really concerned that Sauvignon Blanc could be overplanted in the Central Coast, and we need to keep in mind that removals that are taking place in Central Coast are rarely Sauvignon Blanc. Most of the vines are of prime bearing age or newly planted coming into prime bearing age. So we will see more Sauvignon Blanc available in the Central Coast, and it's still unknown if demand will meet that supply.
Well, I think we also need to call out that there's still a certain amount of non-bearing acreage of Sauvignon Blanc that's coming online over the next 2 to 3 years. Plus, there's some additional graftings that are occurring this spring from things like Merlot and Pinot Noir and even Cabernet, for that matter, that are going into Sauvignon Blanc. So we still have that supply coming online in the next few years. Hence the reason why we caution on this varietal.
And for Lodi Delta, they saw a decrease of 10,000 tons in 2024. This was due to the heat spells that we saw in June and July that diminished the size of the crop. All tonnage did find a home in 2024, but it was, as everybody was talking about, once the realization of the size of the crop happened by wineries, that brought buyers back to the market. So without the size of the crop being small, it would, I'm not sure that everything would have found a home as it did in 2024. And so, yeah.
So we'll talk about district average, although we've covered a little bit about pricing already when we were talking about crop. We'll start off on the North Coast, and then we'll start kind of going through more of a rapid fire pace on some of these other varietals as we move into things that are maybe not as macro perspective or macro important to each and every single region.
Yeah, and I'll start off here on the Sauv Blanc. Again, I want to reiterate, we had a large crop in the North Coast, Lake and Mendocino County, down a little bit in Sonoma and Napa. Price not affected dramatically because there was good demand for that fruit and decent prices paid. I also would say that out of all the varietals this year and starting in 2025, Sauv Blanc, Chardonnay running toe-to-toe with each other in regards to having the most demand currently early in the season. We have seen wineries out taking positions, Spain fairly close to district average pricing, some a little bit below. And but for the most part, there is interest. We do have traction with wineries. Let us know if you have any available. We'd love to work for you.
So Sauvignon Blanc for the Central Coast. Pricing is interesting because we do see the district average price hold in there decent, but that's really due to planting contracts that are most likely at the tail end of their life. The spot market is still lower most of the time than the district average, although there is some price floor to Sauvignon Blanc on the Central Coast.
And for the Central Valley, pricing for districts or Lodi Delta ended up being 544 price per ton, and then South Valley was 532 price per ton, which were almost the same. But we did the most of that activity happened late in the season in 2024.
So we'll move into Pinot Grigio. For everyone on, it is Pinot Grigio and Pinot Gris combined. I know everyone has a difference of opinion on this varietal name, but for the purposes of today, it's all one thing. When we talk about the tons crushed, you'll notice that the importance really falls to the northern and southern interior, but we'll start off in the coast as we have on all the other varietals.
Yeah, thanks, Audra. Not much to talk about in Pinot Gris or Pinot Grigio, whatever you want to call it, in the North Coast. Although, 5-10 years ago, we did see quite a big interest by wineries. Planting contracts and grafting contracts were given out. I actually grafted some acres in the North Coast over to this varietal, and that seemed to last about 3 or 4 years, and it all moved away. So we don't have very many acres left in Pinot Gris or Grigio in the North Coast, and what is out there tends to find a home. Although last year we did have a few small lots of Pinot Gris Grigio that could not find a home for it. So that fruit ended up on the custom crush, and I do believe that there is some demand there on the custom crush. I did want to reiterate one more thing back to Sauv Blanc before we move away from that. I think we currently have listed a million gallons available of Sauv Blanc coming off of last year's crop, and that is never a good sign into the upcoming grape market that that varietal is going to stay that strong. Sorry to go backwards.
Oh, no worries.
Oh, go ahead, Eddie.
So for the Central Coast, similar to North Coast, it is a fairly minor variety in the Central Coast. With that said, it is the hottest variety right now if you do have it in the Central Coast. However, acreage is pretty limited, tons available, and tons crushed, as you can see, is quite small compared to the valley. Yeah.
Would you say that it's a niche varietal, and is there a specific area of the Central Coast that it's more focused on?
Yeah, that's a good point to bring up. It is a niche varietal. People typically are picky on where it's coming from within the Central Coast, or whether or not they want it. And there's issues with pricing as well, because there's really a pretty hard ceiling on pricing. And because of its variability in yield, oftentimes it's hard for growers to break even or really make money on the variety in the Central Coast.
Lodi Delta saw a decrease in tonnage by 25,000 tons in 2024, pretty dramatic. Southern Interior saw a decrease of 10,000 tons. So definitely this was a variety that was affected by the heat. All of it found a home. Some of that was from similar to what we saw with Sauvignon Blanc, with buyers coming back once they started to pick and realized that the size of the crop was down. So, but it all found a home, and that's carried over into 2025. The Pinot Grigio market has had the most activity and re-signs happening to start out the year. So having the short crop has had kind of a knee-jerk effect for buyers getting out a little bit earlier than we saw 1 year ago at this time.
So, Mike, looking at the district average for Pinot Gris in the northern and southern interior, how price sensitive is Pinot Gris in your markets?
It is price sensitive. If it gets above $500-600 a ton, then it prices people out of their bottle prices. So it's that's why it's kept it in the valley, and it's kind of kept it out of the coast because they can't afford to grow it over there.
So we'll move right into red blenders. For the purpose of today with red blenders, it's Zinfandel, Merlot, Syrah, Petit Syrah, Petit Verdot, and Malbec all in one. And we'll go over tons crushed. We won't be working into the district averages too much because that's a little bit more difficult to explain with all those varietals all in. But the market really is treating these varieties kind of a lump sum in most cases, although there are some exceptions like Dry Creek Zinfandel or say Paso Petit Syrah.
Yeah, and red blenders was as tough as Cabernet last year in the North Coast. I'll be honest with you. What I've been told and what I see out there is when we have this much availability of Cabernet, Cabernet becomes the red blender. So very, very little activity in regards to red blenders on the North Coast. We did see some bright spots with some, Old Vine, Dry Creek, Zinfandel. There was some last minute sort of spot market buys on that kind of thing. But outside of that, very, very little red blender contracting happening, even in Napa. I would say, along with Cabernet, red blenders was probably the most left on the vine varietal in Napa this year and in the North Coast in general, except for the Pinot Noir in Sonoma County.
Yeah, for the Central Coast, red blenders were also one of the categories most left on the vine. As far as varieties go, Petit Syrah and Petit Verdot are probably the two most active varieties in the Central Coast. However, demand is slow, and typically wineries see it as interchangeable with other varieties. And if they can get more cab, to Christian's point, they probably are going to do that, and they can right now.
Lodi for the red blender saw a decrease in 6 million case equivalency in 2024. The South Valley saw a decrease of 7.4 million. case equivalency in 2024. Very few transactions happened in the valley for any of the red blenders in 2024, and there was a lot of grapes left on the vine. It was a brutal market for anything red last year.
How impacted are the red blenders on the removals in the Lodi Delta area versus the southern interior? Like, where's the removals coming from?
All up and down the valley. And a lot of that's going to play itself out here in the next month, because there's some guys that are still on the fence if they're going to farm or if they're going to prune. So we'll know here as bud break is rapidly approaching what doesn't get pruned and what is potentially destined for the bulldozer.
In the Central Coast, a lot of the removals have been the 1990s plantings in a lot of regard, and maybe even the early 2000s. Is that the same trend in the Central Valley, or does it matter vine age at this stage?
There are younger red blenders that have happened, and a lot of Malbec that's 15 years old, and that came out of contract and just coming out of the contract at the wrong time. That were initial planning contracts and stuff like that. So those. What was your second part of the question?
Just where the impacts are as far as the regions.
It's up and down the valley. It seems like they're down South Valley. They are more willing to push it out faster than the northern interior, especially if that grower has a lot of different things that they're farming.
And then for removals in the Central Coast, where would you say the removals are the most impacted? Is it north of Monterey County, San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara? Like, where are you seeing the huge changes?
I think if you looked at a percentage of acres that's been pushed in certain regions, Santa Barbara County might probably lead the way, followed by Monterey County and then Paso Robles. But removals are focused on probably the older vineyards or virus vineyards that are less desirable.
Christian, how would you answer that question? For the removals that you've had in the North Coast, I know that it's relative for you up there. Where do you see most of them happening, and what's being removed?
Yeah, great question, Audra. I would tell you that the most removals that are visibly seen are in Napa, and that's due to older vines, virus vines, hard to make sugars the last 3 years. We struggled with trying to place some of that fruit, or having that fruit placed the last 3 years and then it being rejected by wineries. So great time for Napa growers to remove and possibly replant. But that's where you'll see the most balls of vineyard laid out in the areas. After that, I would say Lake County has removed quite a bit of Cabernet between two large growers up there. We're talking thousands of acres of Cabernet removed. It was needed, about time. Again, virused older vines planted in the late 90s, as you mentioned, Audra, some early 2000s. Those vineyards are not going back right away. They're going to sit fallow until this market corrects itself. Whereas Napa, it appears that Napa will replant this year, same year as the pullouts. Now, where we're not seeing as many pullouts is in Sonoma and Mendocino counties. And what we're seeing more in those counties is mothballed vineyards. So not pullouts, but just not farming, or abandoning or partially farming those vineyards in hopes to bring those vineyards back when the market corrects itself.
So that wraps us up for the data at this stage. I think there was some questions that came in.
Yeah, there were actually quite a few. I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of them, but I want to focus. A lot of them came in regarding tariffs, import-export issues, right? In light of today's market. So I want to. Let's see. So a grower out in San Joaquin County asked, what are your thoughts on how the influx of imported grape juice with big wineries reclaiming taxes on those imports is impacting the market? How can local growers effectively compete and protect their position in the industry?
Well, that's a very multifaceted, very complicated question and answer. And it's actually a very complex one, and it's rapidly changing, obviously. So to answer that question in a very accurate way would be near impossible at the moment. And I actually think you can do an entire segment on this topic And perhaps you should. I mean, I think it's a very important factor right now in the industry. It's something that a lot of growers and even wineries, for that matter, are questioning what the outcomes are going to be moving forward. I will say this, that that wine being imported has almost always existed. It's ebbed and flowed, of course, depending upon the economy and the trade aspects of it, and that will likely continue to some degree. I think if anything, that is secondary right now to our sales issue as far as marketing domestic wines and not capturing consumption of the younger generation as we had planned to. I started in this industry in the early 2000s, 2001 specifically. And I remember even then, I'm like the oldest millennial, depending upon, the social graphic aspect. I might even be a Gen Xer, depending upon whose definition we follow. But I remember specifically, like, we must capture the millennials. And this was 20 plus years ago, and we're still struggling to some degree to capture them, as well as the Gen Zers. And so I think that's the bigger issue that we're facing currently to our destiny, and making sure that we have a compelling future. But certainly tariffs and imported bulk wine is a factor and will continue to be.
Yeah, and we actually have a couple more questions that came in on other subjects, but I do want to first, before we go into those final questions, we do have a giveaway to announce here. Baco Tools generously donated a few pruning tools this morning for us to give away, and so I'm just going to announce that winner now. We have a grower who's live with us now, Bob Bender. You are the winner of the Baco Tools. I'll go ahead and pull those out on the table for the camera to see, if the camera can see me okay. We have a few Baco tools. We got some hand pruning tools, as well as a hand pruning saw, if the microphone can still hear me. So congratulations, Bob Benner. Thank you so much for joining us. And we also have a $100 Amazon gift card to give away. And the lucky winner this morning is James Renton. Thank you for joining us this morning, James. We'll reach out to both of you with more information about how we'll get those prizes to you. But once again, thank you for joining us. And let's get back to, I think we have time for probably one more question here. And I wanted to ask, there's a grower out in Sonoma asking about pullouts. What percentage of the 2024 crush volume decrease was from vine removal versus a vineyard that simply didn't sell their fruit? I think we covered some of this already, but I just want to make sure that we're clarifying the point. And how much of that's going to be on the market in 2025?
I think from the perspective of the fact that it came in from Sonoma, it's probably pertinent to have Christian answer this question from the Sonoma perspective. And then if we have time, we'll talk about it in a macro perspective.
Yeah, I'm happy to address the Sonoma side of this. I think it's a different question if you look at California in general, but for Sonoma County, very little affected. The crop crush was very little affected by any pullouts. In fact, I would say not affected at all in Sonoma County, particularly. That was due to no demand for the fruit that was actually left on the vine, and particularly that was for Cabernet and Pinot Noir in Sonoma County.
So if we build it back to the macro perspective, and actually it's kind of hard to do that because it does differ between the regions. For the Central Coast specifically, I would say that heat was a bigger factor, in my opinion, in 2024 than removals were, but removals are going to be a factor in 25 and beyond. And, for the grapes that were left on the vine, and there was a lot less left on the vine in 24 than there was 23, we're talking a lot more in regards to volume. A lot of that fruit's not going to be on the spot market in 25 and 26, but there still will be some. I mean, it's not like it completely dissipated or disappeared. I think the other element too is that we did have some plantings and graftings occur in the Central Coast. And so you're going to see that hit some of the spot market because some of it was on spec over the last couple of years. Whereas in the Central Valley, the grapes that were left on the vine were more due to market than anything else. I don't think you had as many rejections or the factor of rejections in 24 as you did say in 23 with the amount of mildew rejections that there were, right?
Correct.
That really kind of pushed that volume in 23 to, conservatively 325,000 tons left on the vine in California in 23, where we're saying conservatively 100,000, maybe upwards to 200,000 in 24 Thoughts on that, Mike?
Yeah. So sorry, say that one more
Just
time.
thoughts as in regards to reasons why something was left on the vine in 24,
That it
and
was
will it be on
market-
the market in 25?
Market conditions only, and for they're probably going to stay on. It's going to be a similar dynamic that plays into this year as we saw last year, unless something dramatic happens with case sales.
Yeah. So I think, again, trying to answer this in a way that it's a take home for someone that's asking the question. I think the influence of fruit that was available in 24 and 23 is going to be less or so in 25, but we also have had a market slide and a decline in demand. So we're going to still see the same factors involved in the marketplace.
Honestly, I think we've gotten a lot out of this presentation and what tools we can use going into 2025. A lot of it is waiting to see.
It is.
So we appreciate the resiliency of our growers, and we also appreciate you guys coming in this morning to join us. Thank you so much. What a great panel. I'm sure if we were in person, we'd all be we'd applauding you right now. Thank you to the audience for joining us. We look forward to another broadcast soon. This webcast has been recorded and will be available free on YouTube, Spotify, and wherever you listen to your podcasts. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to the audience once again for being a part of this. Have a great day.